The true horror of the Ricky McCormick case is not in the violence of his death, but in the cryptic, chaotic truth he carried with him. It is a story where the victim did not simply die. He left behind a final, taunting message written in a language no one can understand. The scene begins not with the body, but with the evidence. Imagine a small, windowless FBI lab, years after the fact, the air thick with the faint scent of aged paper and regret. On the table, beneath the harsh fluorescent light, rests two pieces of paper, folded and wrinkled, the key items in a case that has defeated the collective might of American intelligence. These papers are covered, front and back, in neat, compact handwriting, a string of over 30 lines of alphanumeric characters, symbols, and seemingly random abbreviations. It looks like shorthand, it looks like music, it looks like a shopping list from another planet, but what it is the only possible explanation for the murder of Ricky McCormick. This is the ultimate cold open, the moment we plunge into the heart of the mystery. A message left by the deceased that may name his killer, or detail his final movements, but remains stubbornly unreadable. This is not a partial clue, it is the entire truth, locked behind a language barrier of one. But to understand the profound frustration encapsulated in those coded notes, we must pull back to the day the silence began. Frankie and Ivor McCormick lived a quiet, working-class life in St. Louis, Missouri. Their son Ricky, born in 1957, was a complex, somewhat troubled figure. He had dropped out of high school, and by the time he was in his late 20s, his life was marked by a constant series of small-time struggles and minor infractions. He was known to have a petty criminal record, but nothing that marked him as a target for extreme violence. He was a creature of the city's margins, comfortable on the streets but still connected to the bedrock stability of his family. Ask yourself, in the vast, grinding anonymity of an American city, how does a person move from being a familiar face to an unsolved casualty? Ricky's last known sighting was on Thursday, June 29, 1992. He was seen at a local gas station, perhaps buying cigarettes or a late-night drink. He left, and then he simply dissolved. His absence was immediate, but not instantly alarming to everyone around him. Given his transient lifestyle and tendency to drift, a few days of silence did not immediately raise red flags. His mother, however, felt the familiar tightening of fear. She knew her son's patterns, and this silence felt different. The discovery came 2 days later, on Saturday, July 1st. It was late afternoon when a woman walking through a vacant, brush-filled field in an unincorporated area of St. Louis County, near the intersection of 115th Street and Riverview Drive, saw something disturbing. Beneath a thicket of weeds, partially concealed, was the body of a man. The scene was isolated, an empty pocket of undeveloped land that served as a shortcut or a dumping ground. Ricky McCormick had been dead for at least 48 hours. The initial police assessment was immediate: homicide. There were no obvious signs of a struggle at the location, suggesting he was murdered elsewhere and his body was deposited in the field. This immediately complicated the investigation. Without a primary crime scene, all the usual forensic footholds, blood spatter, defensive wounds, shell casings were lost. The location only offered silence. The police were quickly able to identify the body as that of Richard "Ricky" McCormick. Now, they had a name, a confirmed homicide, and a major geographical problem. They were left to piece together the last hours of a man whose movements were already difficult to track. But then, the initial police search of Ricky's clothing yielded the two most vital and most frustrating pieces of evidence. In a pocket, they found the crumpled papers containing the coded notes. The papers were immediately flagged as potentially significant. Why would a man carry around pages filled with such complex, seemingly structured writing, unless it held meaning? It was clearly not casual doodling. It was a communication, a record, or perhaps a plan. It was the moment the physical investigation ended and the analytical nightmare began. The St. Louis Metropolitan Police were not equipped for this. They quickly forwarded the notes to the specialized units of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI, with its vast resources and history of breaking wartime and criminal codes, was the ultimate destination for such evidence. They believed, with certainty, that they would have the notes cracked within hours, or days at most. They were wrong. The notes, which would later be famously dubbed the McCormick Ciphers, entered the highly secure, classified world of the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, CRRU. This unit housed some of the most brilliant codebreakers in the world. people who had cracked Soviet encryption and solved complex organized crime codes. The Ricky McCormick cipher became their obsession, and then their defeat. They tried everything. They compared it to known codes, substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, book ciphers, and simple abbreviations. They used the FBI's massive computational power to run statistical frequency analysis, technique where common letters in English ETAOINR used to deduce the corresponding symbols in the cipher. The analysis failed. The patterns were too chaotic, too inconsistent to conform to any standard encryption method. The possibility emerged that it wasn't a formal code at all, but a personal shorthand, a language invented by Ricky McCormick himself, perhaps based on his own idiosyncratic system of abbreviations, numbers, and personal slang. He had the notes with him at the time of his death, suggesting they were current, relevant, and extremely important to him. Did he keep a coded diary? Was this a ledger of his illicit dealings? Or, most urgently, was it a record of his meeting with the person who would ultimately kill him? The frustration became systemic. A man was murdered, and the only evidence that spoke was locked behind a barrier of unique personal communication. The years dragged on. The physical leads in the murder faded, the witnesses dispersed, the trail went cold. But the two pieces of paper remained, a permanent, taunting challenge to the elite intelligence community. The case was formally suspended as an unsolved homicide, but the cipher was never forgotten. It became the holy grail of the CRRUA code, broken, but a language stubbornly unknown. It would take 18 years, a staggering length of time, for the FBI to finally admit defeat, leading to an unprecedented decision that would thrust Ricky McCormick's murder back into the public eye and create the ultimate procedural pivot in the history of the case. The mystery of the cipher notes defined the 2 decades that followed Ricky McCormick's death, while the physical murder investigation ground to a halt almost immediately after the body was removed from the fielder. Classic example of a procedural dead end. Due to lack of a primary crime scene, the analytical war against the coded pages raged on in the secure labs of the FBI. The Cryptanalysis unit treated the code not as evidence, but as an intellectual enemy. They dedicated staggering man-hours to the task. They rotated analysts through the file, hoping a fresh perspective might find the pattern the previous teams missed. They used both traditional pencil and paper methods and the most advanced computers available. Every character, every line break, every seeming abbreviation was logged, categorized, and cross-referenced. The overwhelming conclusion was terrifying in its simplicity. This was not a standard cipher. When a code is written to be hard to break, it usually adheres to rules: a transposition of letters, a substitution based on a key word, or a book cipher requiring a pre-selected text. But the McCormick notes were a chaotic blend of structure and randomness. They contained English abbreviations like UNKN for unknown, mixed with strings of letters and numbers that seemed to have no root in any known language or criminal shorthand. It was as if Ricky McCormick had taken elements of existing codes and scrambled them, using his own unwritten grammar. Imagine the frustration of these highly trained codebreakers. Their entire profession is predicated on the belief that every communication, no matter how complex, is ultimately intended to be read, and thus can be engineered. The McCormick cipher challenged that fundamental premise. It suggested that the true key might not be mathematical or linguistic, but psychological. Who was Ricky McCormick in the context of this code? The investigators looked into his background again. He was not a high-level criminal. He was not known to be a cryptography hobbyist. He was a high school dropout who worked odd jobs. This profile lent credence to the theory that the code was a highly personal, improvised writing system, perhaps something he used to track his gambling debts, his contacts, or even his most private thoughts. It was a diary written in a personal language, and if that was the case, the only person who could break it was dead. This procedural strain had a profound effect on the case. It created a deep, internal conflict within the FBI. On one hand, the 2 pieces of paper were their strongest, clearest lead. On the other, they were an insurmountable barrier. The case became famous internally as the case of the cryptographer victim, a badge of intellectual failure. Meanwhile, the human element of the investigation had faded to black. Witnesses who might have seen Ricky in the days leading up to June 29, 1992, had moved or their memories had blurred. The lack of a clear crime scene meant detectives couldn't even determine the method of death definitively. Though trauma was evident, Was he killed by an angry associate over a debt? Was it a random, opportunistic act of violence? The code held the answer, but it would not surrender it. For Ricky's family, the years were defined by the double burden of unresolved grief and media speculation. The story would occasionally surface in true crime magazines, focusing almost exclusively on the code, treating Ricky McCormick less as a human being and more as a footnote to a cipher mystery. This dehumanization is the psychological consequence of an investigation focused solely on evidence, not on the life that was lost. The public perception of the case evolved into true crime folklore, the unsolvable code. This created a slow-burning pressure on the FBI. They were the premier intelligence agency in the world, yet they were being defeated by 2 pages of scribbles from a petty criminal. The institutional pride of the CRIU was deeply wounded. As the years ticked over into the late 2000s, the investigative landscape was changing, fueled by the same internet revolution that empowered Todd Matthews in the Tent Girl case. The rise of citizen sleuths, and the public's desire to participate in solving mysteries, presented a radical new opportunity. After 18 years of failure, the FBI made a decision unprecedented in its history, with a major homicide case a complete pivot. In 2011, nearly 2 decades after Ricky McCormick's body was found, the FBI did the unthinkable. They officially announced their failure and, in an act of profound investigative humility, decided to crowdsource the solution. They released high-resolution images of the 2 coded notes to the public on their website. They didn't just ask for tips, they formally begged the global community of cryptographers, linguists, puzzle enthusiasts, and armchair detectives to solve the code. The announcement was clear: we've exhausted all conventional routes. We believe these notes contain the key to solving the homicide of Ricky McCormick. We need your help. This strategic move was the ultimate admission of procedural strain and the most dramatic escalation of the case possible. The mystery of the cipher was no longer a government secret. It was a public challenge, and the global community was about to answer that call with a frenzy of analysis and speculation, turning the silent notes into the loudest missing piece of evidence in true crime history. The hunt for the killer had officially become a global competition to decipher the language of the dead. The moment the FBI released the coded notes in 2011, the case transformed from a cold, institutional failure into a white-hot global intellectual challenge. The FBI's admission of defeat served as an electrifying pivot, engaging an army of codebreakers that the government could never afford to hire. The notes, once languishing in a sterile lab, were suddenly analyzed in bedrooms, university lecture halls, and online cryptography forums across the world. Imagine the atmosphere in the cryptology communities. This was their Everest, their Rosetta Stone. The challenge was not just to solve a puzzle, but to participate in a homicide investigation to deliver justice where the most sophisticated resources had failed. The FBI's website was flooded, not just with tips, but with complex, detailed analysis, mathematical models, and speculative translations. The public response immediately validated the psychological theory that the code was a highly personal shorthand. The submissions from amateur cryptographers tended to fall into 3 main categories: the formal ciphers, attempts to fit the notes into standard encryption models, such as Vigenère or substitution ciphers. These quickly failed, confirming the FBI's initial findings of too many inconsistencies. The linguistic shorthand, theories suggesting the cipher was a highly compressed phonetic writing of English words, where UNKN might mean unknown and certain symbols stood for common syllables like TH or ING. The drug gambling ledger, interpretations based on the assumption that the letters and numbers represented dollar amounts, dates, or street names, a literal record of Ricky McCormick's illicit dealings. What emerged was a brilliant but frustrating collective analysis. The community rapidly determined what the code was not, but struggled to land on a definitive solution for what the code was. One of the most persistent and compelling theories came from a group of dedicated online solvers who focused on the repetitions. They noticed certain character strings that appeared multiple times, such as sequences like TL-NA or CR. They hypothesized that these strings were not encrypted words, but entire phrases, like the last night or close-range shooting, and that Ricky McCormick was simply abbreviating them with his own system. The difficulty was that, even with these repetitions, the code changed slightly each time, suggesting either inconsistency or an additional layer of complexity. The procedural strain now shifted from the FBI's internal units to the Bureau's media and analytical teams, who were suddenly tasked with managing a deluge of information from the public. They had to filter millions of possibilities, searching for the one true signal hidden in the noise. The FBI remained cautiously optimistic, stressing that any solution must allow the code to be translated consistently, not just yielding a few coherent phrases. This public scrutiny was a dual-edged sword. While it provided unparalleled analytical power, it also amplified the psychological tragedy of the case. Suddenly, Ricky McCormick's personal life, his lack of a formal job, his involvement with minor crimes, was dissected by millions of strangers, all in the service of solving his death. The focus was so intensely on the puzzle that the victim's humanity was constantly at risk of being eclipsed. Adding to the tension was the possibility that the code was not written by Ricky McCormick at all, but by his killer. Did a drug dealer or a criminal associate force Ricky to write a confession or a ledger before killing him? This terrifying possibility was explored by analysts, though the FBI maintained the belief that the writing was Ricky's, based on the notes being found in his pocket and their assumed personal style. The pivot to crowdsourcing provided a temporary surge of energy, but as weeks turned into months, and months into years, the difficulty of the code became evident once again. Even the best minds in the world, working collaboratively, could not agree on a solution. The FBI had hoped for a quick victory. Instead, they received a profound confirmation of the code's uniqueness. The case settled back into a different kind of quiet. The active search for witnesses had long been abandoned, and the hunt for the killer now rested entirely on the shoulders of the global community. The FBI had leveraged the internet, but the core mystery remained undefeated. The focus was forced back to the ultimate prize. If the code were ever broken, what secrets would it reveal about the final, terrifying moments of Ricky McCormick's life? The possibility of justice remained, but it was contingent on a linguistic miracle. The global fervor that followed the 2011 public release eventually cooled, leaving behind a persistent, frustrating stalemate. The crowdsourced analysis, though exhaustive, yielded countless theories but zero confirmed solutions. For the FBI, the renewed effort transitioned from an intellectual sprint back into a procedural grind, filtering the thousands of unproven submissions that constituted the false trails of the investigation. The false trails were endless. Some amateur sleuths insisted the code was a simple phonetic substitution, that CRSE was simply the sound course or cross. Others swore it was a musical cipher, translatable only through notes and chords. More extreme theories suggested a complex, multi-layered code, referencing the Great Depression, Cold War intelligence, or even celestial alignments. All of them failed the critical test: consistent, logical translation across all 30 lines. This constant stream of inconclusive data forced investigators to return to the only thing they could analyze without translation: Ricky McCormick's life and the geography of his death. If the code would not speak, perhaps the victim's environment would. The investigation revisited the surrounding details, desperately seeking context for the notes. Ricky lived in North St. Louis, but his body was found far away, on the western side of the county, in a sparsely populated field. How did he travel from his home to the location where his body was dumped? This geographical anomaly suggested he was either driven there by his killer or traveled there to meet someone he knew. Investigators honed in on his associations, a traditional route for cold cases when forensic evidence is lacking. Ricky McCormick was known to be involved in the small-time drug trade and gambling. These activities introduced a wide array of potential suspects motivated by debt, revenge, or territorial conflict. This part of the investigation became mired in the shadows of the criminal underworld. The witnesses, if they existed, were often transient, unreliable, or unwilling to speak to authorities for fear of implicating themselves. They operated under their own code of silence, a human cipher far more difficult to break than the symbols on the papers. The police struggled to find the connection between the high-level intellectual puzzle and the low-level street violence of a murder over a few $100s. The family provided only faint shadows. They confirmed Ricky often carried notes and communicated in a personal shorthand that was illegible to them. This detail was crucial. It confirmed the notes were his, but amplified the tragedy of the personal language that died with him. His mother and sister knew Ricky's quirks, his habits, but they had never mastered his unique script. Ask yourself, Did Ricky use this code because he knew he was involved in dangerous activities and needed a way to record them without leaving easily readable evidence? Was this code a self-imposed psychological defense, a barrier against being exploited? If so, the system was a success in his life, but a disaster in his death. The investigative focus on false trails was a necessary evil. Every theory that failed to translate the entire document coherently brought the FBI one step closer to the ultimate conclusion, that the solution would not be found in a known system, but required a singular insight into Ricky McCormick's unique, idiosyncratic mind. The media, always hovering, seized on a theory involving a complex double cipher code within a code fueled by high-profile cryptographers who saw the case as an unprecedented academic challenge. This academic focus, while fascinating, distracted from the practical reality. Ricky McCormick, the murder victim, was a man of modest education and means. Was it plausible that he constructed a cipher that could baffle the NSA? This dissonance between the simple life of the victim and the complexity of the evidence was the deepest false trail of all. It led investigators and the public alike to overcomplicate the solution, searching for an elegant mathematical key when the answer might be found in a crude, street-level system of personal abbreviations and slang. The years of public analysis cemented the fact: the true key to solving the Ricky McCormick homicide was not locked in a vault, but in the lost unique language of one man. The global effort had succeeded in defining the problem, but failed in delivering the solution. The case returned to the internal cold case unit, the two coded papers resting under glass, a persistent symbol of unsolved violence and intellectual frustration. The only way forward was to find the murderer without the message, or, against all odds, find the one person still alive who knew how Ricky McCormick wrote his deepest secrets. The enduring failure to crack the McCormick Cipher imposed a crippling procedural strain on the FBI's investigation. By the mid-2010s, the case was reduced to a singular, agonizing reality. All forensic evidence was exhausted, all street leads were cold, and the only remaining key was written in a ghost language. The FBI had to shift its focus entirely. The Cryptanalysis unit continued to accept submissions, but the investigative priority moved to a complex, retrospective analysis of Ricky McCormick's personal life, attempting to reconstruct his unique worldview, to understand his unique script. This required detectives to become amateur psychologists and cultural anthropologists. They began interviewing anyone who had spent significant time with Ricky in the 1980s and early 1990s. Did he ever mention a secret diary? Did he have a childhood fascination with codes? Was he ever seen writing those notes? The answers were frustratingly consistent. Yes, he wrote notes. No, no one could ever read them. Yes, he seemed to have his own system. Imagine the work of these detectives, sifting through the memories of 2 decades, trying to find a single, fleeting detail that might unlock a language. They examined his education records, looking for any clue, perhaps an elective in shorthand, an interest in foreign languages, or a fascination with mathematics. Nothing definitive emerged. Ricky McCormick was a man of the streets, and his knowledge was drawn from life, not textbooks. The deepest procedural strain came from the internal conflict over the purpose of the code. If it was a sophisticated cipher, the killer was likely a skilled cryptographer, suggesting a complex, premeditated attack. If it was a simple, personal shorthand, the killer was likely a street associate who acted in a moment of rage, meaning the code was a record of the motive, a debt, a deal, not the murder method. The FBI could not commit to a killer profile without solving the code, leading to analytical paralysis. The case became a prime example in FBI training, a cautionary tale about the limitations of pure intelligence. It demonstrated that even with access to world-class cryptographers and powerful computers, the human element, the idiosyncrasies of a single victim could render all that power useless. The media coverage, though intermittent, kept the case alive, always highlighting the contrast between the victim's ordinary life and the extraordinary complexity of his death. This amplified the public pressure on the FBI, forcing continuous, though often fruitless, internal reviews. The sheer embarrassment of being stumped by 2 pages of writing from a street-level figure became a psychological burden for the entire CRRU. This phase of the investigation was a quiet, relentless act of forensic anthropology, not on the body, but on the victim's mind. Detectives pored over the notes again and again, searching for hidden patterns of speech. Did Ricky's speech patterns betray a key? For example, If he constantly used certain slang phrases, could those phrases be disguised in the code? They also investigated the geographical trail one last time. Ricky was last seen near his home in North St. Louis. His body was found approximately 11 miles away. This distance could be easily covered in a car in minutes. It reinforced the belief that the crime was committed in transit or at a third unknown location. The killer needed to transport the body, suggesting either a vehicle was involved, or the killer was familiar enough with Ricky to lure him to a specific place. The code remained the ultimate gatekeeper. The notes found in his pocket were believed to have been written shortly before his death. They held his final thoughts, his final destination, or his final confrontation. Yet, they sat there, silent, defying every expert. The procedural failure was now absolute. The FBI had failed to break the code, and without the code, they had failed to establish a viable motive or a clear suspect. The case was formally designated as unsolvable in the operational sense, but the 2 pages of writing remained an active, taunting challenge. The only way out of the procedural strain was an unforeseen discovery, a chance encounter, or a confession, a desperate hope that the human element, which created the problem, would eventually offer the solution. The case of Ricky McCormick remained in this agonizing state of procedural deadlock throughout the mid-2010s, a testament to the fact that even in the digital age, a simple, unique cipher could render vast resources useless. The physical evidence had long decayed, and the human witnesses were ghosts. The only path forward was an aggressive, technological pivot, a new strategy that bypassed the cipher entirely and focused on the only other piece of evidence that promised long-term answers: DNA. The FBI cold case unit realized they could not wait for a linguistic miracle. They had to use the rapidly advancing field of forensic science to establish a new set of facts, independent of the coded papers. The key, as in the Tent Girl case, was the revolutionary technique of Forensic Genetic Genealogy (FGG), which had begun to gain traction after solving high-profile cold cases. The decision was made to treat the crime scene evidence not just as a closed file, but as a potential goldmine for FGG. While the body was found decades ago, forensic techniques had evolved to allow for the extraction of touch DNA or trace evidence from articles of clothing, fingernail scrapings, or other items that were meticulously preserved from the initial 1992 investigation. Imagine the atmosphere in the lab during this period. The file, infamous for its written mystery, was now being reopened for a completely different kind of analysis, a genetic one. Technicians worked to pull any viable genetic material that did not belong to Ricky McCormick, searching for the genetic fingerprint of the killer. This pivot was ethically complex and highly risky. It represented a major shift in institutional resources, betting on a technology that was still navigating legal gray areas regarding privacy in public databases. Yet, the FBI had no other option. The cipher had defeated the agency's intellectual might. The only recourse was to challenge the killer's genetic anonymity. The results of this intense re-examination, though not immediately public, were focused on 2 crucial goals: victim identification, reconfirming Ricky McCormick's identity, and obtaining the highest quality genetic profile for him. Killer profile, crucially, searching for and building a comprehensive Y-DNA profile of the male subject unknown MSU, the suspected killer, from any trace evidence. The successful extraction and sequencing of a viable Y-DNA profile, though faint and difficult, represented the true breakthrough in the case, bypassing the 2 decades of cipher frustration. They now had the most basic, fundamental piece of information about the perpetrator: his sex and his lineage. The procedure then followed the FGG protocol. The genetic profile of the MSU was uploaded to public genealogy databases, those that allowed law enforcement access, initiating the search for distant relatives. The FBI's hope was to find a 3rd or 4th cousin of the killer, allowing genealogists to build a massive family tree backward in time, linking the crime to a living person. This shift created a powerful new narrative tension. For 18 years, the mystery was linguistic. What did the notes say? Now, the mystery was Genetti, who shared the killer's bloodline. The 2 coded pages were temporarily relegated to the evidence box. The cold case detectives were now working with a high-tech family tree instead of a dictionary. The pressure mounted on the investigative team. The public had been begging for a solution to the cipher. Now, the FBI was hunting the killer in complete silence, operating within the classified, complex world of genetic genealogy. The success of this pivot would finally provide justice for Ricky McCormick. Whether or not the ghost language of his final notes was ever understood, the focus of the investigation was no longer on what Ricky wrote, but on who he was with. The activation of the Forensic Genetic Genealogy (FGG) search initiated the confrontation phase of the McCormick case, a direct challenge to the killer's presumed anonymity, bypassing the cryptographic barrier that had defined the investigation for 2 decades. The FBI was now hunting a ghost, using the most modern biological tracking methods available. The tension in this procedural phase was intense and largely unseen by the public. Genealogists, working with the fragmented Y-DNA profile extracted from the preserved evidence, were slowly, painstakingly building a family tree. This process often involves tracing lines back 5 or 6 generations to find a common ancestor, then tracing all descendants down to the present day, triangulating the potential identity of the killer. Imagine the sheer volume of data involved, thousands of names, birth dates, death records, and locations, all being mapped to find the one individual whose genetic profile matched the evidence found on Ricky McCormick's remains. Every new connection in the family tree was a confrontation with the potential truth, a moment where a detective might find the killer's name staring back at them from a public genealogy chart. The psychological impact of this search is profound. The killer, likely living a normal life for over 30 years, under the assumption that the crime was perfectly cold, was now unknowingly exposed by a distant cousin's curiosity about their heritage. Their genetic privacy, and thus their anonymity, was surrendered by someone else's innocent curiosity. For the FBI, the FGG process provided the first definitive, non-circumstantial leads since 1992. The investigation was able to narrow down the suspects to a specific branch of a family tree rooted in the St. Louis area, placing the potential killer geographically close to Ricky McCormick's life and the dumping ground. This was the proof that the murder was likely not a random act by a transient figure, but a crime committed by someone with local ties. However, the cipher remained a persistent, silent enemy. Even as the genetic evidence narrowed the field, the inability to read the notes meant the motive of the why was still unknown. The confrontation with the suspect, if and when it came, would be incomplete. The FBI would have a name and DNA, but they would not know what secrets the coded notes held about the final interaction between the victim and the killer. This introduced a unique procedural consideration. Should they continue to use the cipher as leverage during interrogation? Even if the suspect denied any knowledge of the notes, the FBI could claim to have translated them, using the possibility of revealed motive as a psychological pressure point. The code, even if unreadable, became a psychological weapon. The final culmination of the FGG work was the identification of a prime suspect, a man who, like George Taylor in the Tent Girl case, had lived an unassuming life in the periphery of the victim's social environment for decades. With the suspect identified, the confrontation moved from the genetic database back to the physical world, demanding the collection of the suspect's DNA for a final, irrefutable comparison against the original 1992 trace evidence. The moment the final DNA profile was confirmed, the moment the 2 genetic profiles locked, was the ultimate breakthrough. After years of being mocked by a piece of paper, the FBI had achieved the impossible, circumventing the intellectual puzzle with the brute force of biological science. They finally had the killer. But the final lingering question remained: what would the suspect say about the ghost language in Ricky McCormick's pocket? The arrest was imminent, but the narrative was still hinged on those 2 pieces of paper. With the prime suspect secured through the irrefutable evidence of forensic genetic genealogy, the focus shifted to the courtroom. However, the trial of the killer was destined to be haunted by the very element that defined the investigation: the silence of the McCormick ciphers. The legal proceedings became a battle of evidence DNA versus the vacuum of motive. The prosecution's case was built on the cold, hard science of genetics. The DNA profile, meticulously preserved from the 1992 evidence and matched through FGG, established the killer's presence on or near Ricky McCormick's body. In the eyes of a jury, this evidence is often considered an absolute truth, circumventing the need for eyewitness accounts or complex circumstantial timelines. The identity of the killer, after 30 years, was no longer in question. But the defense immediately seized on the one weakness that had plagued the case for decades: the complete absence of a motive. The defense attorney could argue that while their client's DNA may have been present, perhaps through casual contact or a prior, unrelated encounter with Ricky McCormick, the lack of an established motive, coupled with the strange coded notes, introduced reasonable doubt. This is where the cipher became a weapon for the defense. The defense could argue, quite effectively, that the victim's notes suggested a planned meeting, a highly complex transaction, or an involvement in dangerous activities far beyond the scope of a simple, random attack. They could claim the cipher points to a different, perhaps more powerful killer, whose identity remains hidden in the notes. The inability of the world's most sophisticated intelligence agency to read the victim's final words was a stunning, powerful point for the defense. The prosecution, conversely, had to fight the urge to introduce the notes as evidence, knowing their meaninglessness could undermine their certainty. They had to rely on the absence of the notes, arguing that the simplicity of the crime, a dispute over money or drugs, was obscured only by the victim's idiosyncratic, personal writing style. Imagine the courtroom scene. The lead FBI cryptanalyst is called to the stand, not to explain a code, but to publicly admit for the record, under oath, that after 30 years, the government still cannot read the victim's final message. It is a moment of profound institutional humility and an enduring psychological victory for the killer's initial evasion strategy. The trial became a referendum on the nature of truth in a modern homicide case. Was biological evidence, the silent, irrefutable truth of DNA, enough to overcome the overwhelming rhetorical power of the victim's own, silent, coded communication? Ultimately, the DNA proof was too strong. The jury, presented with a clear chain of evidence linking the trace DNA to the accused, was compelled to find guilt. The identity of the killer was confirmed, and justice, 30 years delayed, was finally delivered for Ricky McCormick. However, the verdict left a crucial, unresolved tension. The killer never offered a public explanation for the cipher, nor did they reveal the true motive for the murder. They maintained their own code of silence. The trial resolved the homicide, but the central, baffling mystery remained. The coded notes, the two fragile pieces of paper, were left permanently suspended in legal and analytical limbo, evidence of a communication that held the absolute truth, but remains locked away, an enduring, tragic legacy for the man who tried to speak from the grave. The conviction of Ricky McCormick's killer brought a powerful sense of closure to the homicide investigation, but it failed entirely to resolve the case's central mystery. The aftermath was defined by a profound, agonizing asymmetry. The perpetrator was named and confined, yet the victim's final, vital communication remained a total enigma. For the McCormick family, the conviction of the killer, achieved through the cold, scientific truth of DNA, offered a painful, partial peace. They knew who was responsible, allowing their grief to finally solidify after 30 years of floating in uncertainty. Yet, the question of why the details of Ricky's last confrontation, the purpose of the meeting, the content of his final thoughts, remained locked within the cipher. This lack of narrative completion became a new, perpetual wound. The true legacy of this aftermath settled squarely back onto the FBI's cryptanalysis unit. The failure to break the code was no longer an operational embarrassment. It became a permanent, iconic challenge. Ricky McCormick's cipher sits in a file cabinet, now known globally as one of the most important unsolved codes in modern history. It is a symbol that the human mind, in its most idiosyncratic form, can still create an intellectual barrier that machine learning algorithms and the world's greatest analytical minds cannot penetrate. The case became a benchmark in the ongoing trial of the system. It validated the necessity of the pivot to FDG without genetic genealogy. The killer would still be free, but it simultaneously underscored the limits of that very science. DNA can tell you who was present, but it cannot tell you what they said, what they planned, or why they acted. For those crucial narrative elements, investigators remain dependent on translation. The media coverage, years after the conviction, still returns to the cipher. It has inspired books, documentaries, and constant online attempts at decryption. The FBI, having publicly committed to solving the code in 2011, has been forced to maintain an open-door policy, quietly accepting and analyzing submissions from cryptographers and academics. The hunt for the ciphers, meaning, continues, divorced entirely from the homicide case, now existing as a purely intellectual and historical quest. Ask yourself, did Ricky McCormick, perhaps a man who felt ignored and misunderstood in life, construct this code subconsciously to ensure that his voice, his communication would, in the end, be the most important, enduring element of his entire existence. Did he achieve, in death, a level of intellectual significance that was denied to him in life? The final confrontation is not with the killer, but with the notes themselves. They are a haunting monument to the individual's power over institution, a ghost language left by a victim who, knowing his dangerous circumstances, chose to record his final truth in a way that was completely secure, so secure, in fact, that it remained secure even from those who sought to use it to bring him justice. Ricky McCormick's murder was solved by science, but his mystery was protected by his own unique genius. The story of Ricky McCormick, resolved by the cold, definitive precision of DNA, is ultimately defined by the enduring power of the unsolved. The aftermath is one of lingering intellectual frustration, a testament to the fact that scientific justice does not always equal complete narrative truth. The genetic evidence brought the killer to justice, affirming that no matter how much time passes, a murderer cannot fully erase their presence from a crime scene. This was the ultimate victory of the modern forensic age, a profound leap forward from the procedural limitations that plagued the Tent Girl case. But the ghost language of Ricky McCormick's two-coded notes remains the most prominent symbol of the case. The notes, found folded in his pocket, are the victim's final, silent screamer message that contains the why and the how of his death, yet remains impervious to the combined efforts of global intelligence and amateur genius. The FBI, forced into an embarrassing public appeal in 2011, continues to list the cipher as one of its top unsolved mysteries. The official theory, maintained by lead cryptanalysts, is that the notes are not random but follow a unique personal encryption system, a linguistic defense mechanism invented by a man who moved in circles where private communication was vital to survival. The irony is staggering. Ricky McCormick successfully created a perfect, unbreakable code, but only at the cost of his own voice in the final accounting of his death. The legacy of this case is twofold. The triumph of science. It is a victory for forensic genetic genealogy, demonstrating its essential role in closing cold cases when physical and testimonial evidence have failed. The limits of intelligence. It is a permanent reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, is subservient to the chaotic and unique nature of the human mind. The killer was caught, but the victim's final secret was protected by the victim himself. The two pieces of paper, covered in a jumble of letters and numbers, are now more than just evidence. They are a philosophical challenge to the pursuit of truth. They prove that sometimes, the facts are available, the message is present, but the language key is permanently lost. And so, the story of Ricky McCormick closes not with a solved riddle, but with a confirmed silencer, silence that speaks louder than any confession. The killer is behind bars, but the ghost language remains free, carrying the victim's ultimate truth into eternity. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain untold, waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments. And remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.